friends, and welcome to this week's episode. If you haven't joined me before, I'm Dr. Susan. I'm a board-certified gynecologist. I'm also a certified menopause practitioner, and I've been working 100% in the space of midlife wellness, creating longevity strategies and wellness plans for women in perimenopause, menopause, and beyond. So sometimes I find topics that are really confusing, and I try to make them simple. So if I don't understand them, I'm guessing you don't either. And one of those is all of this conversation about fats. Which ones are healthy? Which ones are not? What are healthy fats? What are unhealthy fats? How much should we eat? All of that stuff. Now, this could get really sciencey really fast, so bear with me. I'm going to go through each of the 4 primary fats that you might hear talked about. Those are saturated fats, trans fats, polyunsaturated fats, and monounsaturated fats. Hang in there. And then we'll talk about the pros and cons of each. What are they? Where can you find them? What are the recommendations about how much we should eat of each one? And then what are their potential dangers of each, and why are people getting so upset about some of them? So let's see if we can cover that today. I know that's an ambitious goal. All right, going back to what these things are. What is a saturated fat? Let's start with answering that question. What's it saturated with? Well, fats are long chains of carbon atoms with hydrogen atoms stuck on. So if you took chemistry, you might remember a carbon atom has 4 potential spots for hydrogens to stick onto, or other things. So saturated fats are completely saturated. That means each carbon's got 4 hydrogens around it, stuck together in a chain. Because of that, it's completely straight. And because it's completely straight, they can stick together and form a solid. So saturated fats are generally solid. Typically, we think of saturated fats as animal fats, and that's often the case, like bacon, butter, lard, chicken fat. If you put it in the fridge or even at room temperature and it's solid, that's a saturated fat. But some saturated fats are from vegetables like coconut oil and palm oil. So when we start talking about pros and cons of that, not all of this is animal fat. All right, so let's put saturated fat over here for a minute. And then in a moment, I'm going to talk about why we should or should not eat saturated fat. So let's hold that thought. Second on the list was trans fat. Now, trans fats, let's just say we don't want to eat those. Those are generally created by humans so that they look solid. So for example, do you remember margarine and the old Crisco? Those were made in a lab from oil to be solid so that we could use them for, can't believe it's not butter and all those things we used to eat in the 80s. In fact, I remember in the 80s, my mom was diagnosed with high cholesterol, and her doctor told her, because this is what we thought at the time, she needed to stop eating all animal products, take all the fat out of everything, so no butter, skim milk, low-fat cheese, all the things. So we were eating margarine, which since has been shown to be the worst thing you could eat because it's full of trans fat. So now the FDA has actually banned trans fat in foods. However, you still get some because there's a teeny bit that can slide under the radar and still be allowed. So we're getting a little bit, but look for things that say no trans fat if you can. And then keep in mind that any vegetable oil can turn into a trans fat at high enough temperature. So deep fried foods, even if they're not made with Crisco, because it's not allowed to be used anymore, or margarine, same, it's still going to turn into trans fat because of the high heat. So deep fried foods are still a source of trans fat. And I'll just put that in the not controversial bucket. Pretty much everything else has some controversy around it, and there are people on one side or the other of the argument about whether you should or shouldn't do this, but pretty much everyone agrees that trans fats are bad. In that era in the 80s and 90s when we were switching over to margarine and all of the other things that were supposed to replace the unhealthy animal fats, people got sick. Heart disease went up. Lipid panels got worse. So we had to kind of rethink that idea. Anyhow, we're going to avoid trans fats. Let's just agree on that, except knowing that we do get a little bit anyway, and don't eat fried foods. Then, moving on to the next category, which is unsaturated fats. Well, remember we talked about saturated fats are a straight line because the carbons are all stuck together. Well, unsaturated fats mean at least one hydrogen is missing, so the carbons can stick together with double bonds. And what happens in that case is the straight chain gets a little kink in it. And the kink might be a different angle or in a different place depending on how many of those hydrogens are missing, because some are monounsaturated. That would mean one double bond. And some are polyunsaturated, and that would mean two or more double bonds. Well, suffice to say, because they get a zigzaggy appearance, they don't stick together, and then they're liquid at room temperature. So as an example, a monounsaturated fat that is very common and widely talked about is oleic acid, which is the primary oil in olive oil. Now, little side note, olive oil is not 100% monounsaturated. Every oil has a little bit of everything, but olive oil is primarily oleic acid, so we talk about it being a monounsaturated fat because it mostly is. Now, all olive oil has a little bit of polyunsaturated fat in it. Doesn't matter, it's still really healthy, but just to say the percentage of monounsaturated to polyunsaturated in different oils is different, and that's where a lot of this controversy comes from that I'll get into shortly. So monounsaturated, the main one we talk about is olive oil, and then polyunsaturated oils, also liquid, would be those that have more linoleic acid in them, and linoleic acid is not poisonous, as some people say, but there are some arguments about it being not as healthy as oleic acid, so we'll discuss that argument and see where you fall and what you decide. But again, to remember, olive oil is mostly oleic acid, monounsaturated, and a little bit, depending on the brand, could be up to 5 to even 20% linoleic acid, which is polyunsaturated. And then the seed oils, now lots of people get really excited about seed oils, usually in a negative way, and we'll talk about why that might be. Seed oils have more linoleic acid. Some of them have tons of linoleic acid, like soybean oil, for example, which is the most predominant oil that's used in this country because it's cheap and we make tons of it and it's in everything. So every single thing that's made with oil, every restaurant you go to, every packaged food, everything has vegetable oil in it that is most likely a seed oil with a ton of polyunsaturated fat. Now, I'm not going to say that's bad right now, but let's just agree that that's a fact. So different oils have different amounts of monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fat, and they've gotten different reputations as being better or worse as a result. I think we can all agree on that. Okay, so let's start with olive oil. Pretty much nobody I've ever met has anything bad to say about olive oil. I think we can all agree that olive oil is healthy, and many, many studies have shown that to be true, coming from the Mediterranean diet, studying populations that eat liters of olive oil every year. Pretty much every single study has shown that they have superior heart health to ours in the traditional American diet where we eat less olive oil. So that's where all of this excitement about olive oil started. It's been around since ancient times. There's so much history with olive oil, and we know it's very healthy for the heart. It does not adversely affect the lipid profile. It tastes great. So if you're going to cook with something or use something to make salad dressing, you can be pretty comfortable that olive oil is a good choice. And it kind of stays out of all the controversy that some of the other oils get stuck in that we'll talk about in a moment. Now, there's always controversy, right? So in the olive oil bucket, yes, there's some discussion about how olive oil in this country isn't always what it's advertised to be. The whole extra virgin classification doesn't really have any regulatory board in this country. There certainly is one in Europe. They have an International Olive Commission that tests this stuff, and there's a lot of criteria that you have to meet to be able to call it extra virgin. We don't have that here. So there are cases where things are sold as being very pure extra virgin olive oil that they're not. They might be cut with other oils, maybe even 50% soybean oil, or all kinds of things happen. But for the most part, if you're buying a very reputable oil, let's just assume that olive oil is safe and it's almost all monounsaturated and not full of a bunch of other junk. But get it from a good source and obviously do some research. And if it's really cheap, chances are it was produced in a way that isn't ideal. So yes, there's lots of qualities of oil, and lots of people argue about the best olive oil versus the ones that are not as good, and kind of like wine. There's better ones than others, but let's just say they're all safe. All right, that's gonna be done with the olive oil conversation, even though it could be much longer. Now, let's move on to seed oils. So what are seed oils? Well, there are seeds, and they can be pressed to get the oil out of them, obviously. So common things like soy or safflower or canola or many other seeds can be used to produce oil. Sometimes something is just called vegetable oil, which is a combination of who knows what all together. The controversy with these things is due to an idea that linoleic acid, which is the primary polyunsaturated fat in these vegetable oils, can convert into something called arachidonic acid, which can then set off a whole inflammatory response and release these things called cytokines that can cause harmful things in your body, including elevating cholesterol, being bad for your heart, being bad for weight, being bad for everything you can think of. Now, does that happen all the time? No, it doesn't. Just because that can sometimes happen doesn't mean it happens all the time. So my personal opinion is that whole angle of thought has been blown a little bit out of proportion. However, we've got a lot more to learn about how that works. So my personal opinion is, in the meantime, while we're figuring out just how bad these things are or whether they are bad at all, stick with olive oil. You can't go wrong with that. Now, even if you decided you were not going to eat seed oils, you're going to get some unless you live in a bubble, because they're in everything, everywhere, in every restaurant, salad dressing. Everything you buy is going to be made with one of these seed oils. So if you tried to eliminate it completely, unless you, again, lived on an organic farm yourself and ate nothing that came from outside, you're still going to get some. So even trying to minimize it, you will still get some, and that is probably just fine. Remember, olive oil has some linoleic acid in it too, so it's not that it's poisonous. The thought is just that if you're eating tons of it, because it is so prevalent, that it could cause inflammation. Now, that's a buzzword. What does that mean? Let me tell you what I think inflammation means. Inflammation is your immune system's healthy reaction to something that you've ingested or been exposed to that it's trying to get rid of. Okay, so that is a life-saving process. For example, if I have a terrible infection and I get a fever, that's my body's immune system coming in to kill it, and thank goodness that happens because that keeps us alive. So inflammation is good if it's acute. So something poisonous comes in, something toxic, a virus. Inflammation is our body's immune system bringing in all of these things like cytokines to get rid of it. So there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, we need it to survive. What happens is when we're in a state of chronic inflammation is when we start to get sick. So if we're in that state all the time or for prolonged periods, that's what causes problems. So if you're in the camp that believes that seed oils are inflammatory and you're eating them breakfast, lunch, and dinner, yes, that could create chronic inflammation. And how does it work? Well, the thought is that when we put something into our gut, it messes up the healthy bacteria in our gut, our amazing gut biome, causing stuff to leak into our system, which it shouldn't do, and then our immune system attacks it, and then we've got this fire going on that causes illness all over the place, from joint pain to insulin going up to fat storage, heart disease, Alzheimer's, everything you don't want, right? So the idea is that we want to reduce chronic inflammation, And a thought is that reducing seed oils will achieve that goal. Now, I'm not 100% convinced that that's quite that clear, yet I just want you to understand what that argument is when you read out there that seed oils are terrible and all the things. And they're possibly not the best choice, so let's stick with olive oil for now while that's being figured out. So I think sometimes when people are really on the fringe of anything, it can get a little bit far from reality. There are very few studies suggesting that seed oils are harmful. There really are very few. In fact, omega-6 fatty acids, which is the culprit that everybody worries about, that these seed oils have too much omega-6. Omega-6 are really healthy. In fact, they're in the bucket of what's called essential fatty acids, meaning we need them to live. But like everything, their argument is about how much we need. So back to this omega-6 idea. We all know about omega-3s. Everybody knows those are great, right? Omega-3s have a great reputation, very difficult to come up with an argument where there's anything bad about omega-3s. Now, omega-3s are polyunsaturated fatty acids, mostly found in marine foods, as you know, like fish oil, algae, and then plant sources like flax seeds, chia seeds, etc. So the argument about omega-3 is pretty neutral. I don't think anybody who's very educated would ever say that we need less omega-3. Omega-6, on the other hand, has some haters. Now, one way of looking at it is this. I absolutely love this test. I've talked about it before, called Omega Quant. So Omega Quant is a way to measure your omega-3 and omega-6 status, amongst other things. Now, just deviating how they do this, we can't draw your blood and get an accurate measure of these things because they're actually in the cell wall. And so you could take a biopsy of your tissue, but nobody likes that. So instead, you can get this little card. It's sent to your house, and you prick your finger and put a drop of blood on the card and send it into the lab. And they're actually looking at the amount of omega-3 and 6 in the cell wall of the red blood cell. Okay, so then you get a number called an omega index, omega-3 index, and that's great. We want that to be high, greater than 8. Getting to the controversy part, it also tells you your omega-6 level. So here's the point that I'm getting to. In the old days, when we ate healthy food, the ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 was very different than it is now. In the average American, currently, the omega-6 to 3 ratio is very high, 6 to 3, maybe 16 to 1. It used to be something more like 2 to 1 when we were eating healthy foods. And the theory is that this high omega-6 to 3 ratio is part of the problem that causes all of these health issues that are becoming so prevalent. Heart disease, diabetes, weight gain, inflammation, gut problems, etc. Now, I love the company that makes Omega Quant. I'm not affiliated with them, but their opinion is that it's less important what your omega-6 level is, but more important that your elevated omega-3 reduces that ratio. Does that make sense? Just a little bit of math. So, for example, if your omega-6 is at a certain level and your omega-3 is down here, if you bring your omega-3 level up, then that ratio will get better. So these days, the recommended ratio is something like 3 to 1 or 5 to 1. So omega-6 is going to be higher than omega-3, but we don't want it to be 16 to 1. That appears to have some unhealthy effects, particularly for the heart. So does that make sense? We need omega-6, but we don't need as much as we're getting, and we can elevate our omega-3 so that that ratio is more preferable. And I think that's a good way of looking at it. I've done that test myself. It's really interesting. So I just encourage you to do it. You can order it online. Knowing your omega-3 index is great because then you know, do I need to take a supplement or do I not need to take a supplement? Am I getting everything I need from my diet? In my case, my omega index was 5, and then I took supplements and I eat fish now, and now it's over 8, which is great. And that is associated with improvement in heart health, brain health, mental function, even depression, anxiety, so many things. So that's a little side note. Remember, omega-3 and omega-6 are polyunsaturated fatty acids, so we can't just say as a bucket that all polyunsaturated fatty acids are terrible, or all of anything can be terrible, except maybe trans fats. Everything has nuances and subtleties. Nothing is that simple. So when people say polyunsaturated fats are terrible and you should never eat any of them, no, not quite that simple. All right, so we've discussed monounsaturated fat. That's olive oil. We all agree that's fine. We've discussed trans fats. We pretty much all agree that's not fine. Polyunsaturated, I think we can come to a conclusion that they're not all bad. We want to reduce the omega-6, which is found in linoleic acid or seed oils, and increase our omega-3, which is also a polyunsaturated fatty acid, but is a healthier one. So if I haven't confused you yet enough, let me just talk a bit more about saturated fat. Okay, so let's talk about animal fats first of all. Those of you who are about my age, remember in the 1980s and 90s, we were all told you had to stop eating fat. Remember, fat-free everything. You could buy fat-free Twinkies and fat-free bread and fat-free ice cream and everything fat-free. And that was terrible. So we cut out the fat, but we replaced it with something much worse. Not only that, all the sugar flavorings, everything else, that was a terrible idea, and we learned a lesson from that because people got really sick. So not only elevating our lipid profile, causing heart disease, but not causing weight loss, which was the whole point of the experiment. So we know that being fat-free is not a good idea. Fats are necessary, they're really healthy, and saturated fats are not bad. We need to lose our fear of fat. So yes, anything in excess is going to cause some problems. People on carnivore diets who are eating steak and butter for breakfast with no vegetables or fiber are often going to see an elevation in their cholesterol, and that leads to heart issues, but not always. It's not that simple. So we were taught when I was a young doctor that to lower cholesterol, simply tell people to stop eating animal fats or even animal products altogether. But that was a very simple and incorrect recommendation because, in fact, diet makes a small effect on our cholesterol for most people, but the biggest effect is the cholesterol that we produce in our own body from our liver. A lot of that's genetic, and a lot of it's driven by other things that are not animal fats. So this is so interesting, and I've really had to change my tune about it because I talked for years about how all you had to do is stop eating animal fats and your cholesterol would drop because, in fact, cholesterol is only in animal products. Cholesterol is not in vegetables. It's a product of animal cell walls. So if you think about it, one would think that if you stopped eating animal stuff, your cholesterol would drop. Well, wasn't that simple. Turned out not to really work that way. Some people can eat buckets of animal products and their cholesterol's fine, and other people can be vegan and their cholesterol's terrible. So there's much more to it than that, and nutrition has a small effect in most people, but not a very big one. So then what is happening? It's true that other things elevate our cholesterol that have nothing to do with animal fats. The way that sugar and insulin resistance, for example, affects the metabolism of our liver causes our liver to way overproduce cholesterol. So simply fixing insulin resistance and reducing sugar intake improves our cholesterol, which in turn improves heart health. So it's much more complex than we used to think, but just to bottom line it for you, do not be afraid of fat. These days, most people say things like 30% of our total energy should come from fat, maybe 5 to 10% from saturated fat, the rest from vegetable sources, and you can argue about whether you want olive oil or safflower oil or avocado oil or something else. Getting rid of trans fat's a good idea. Now, how on earth do you calculate 30% of your energy unless you're drinking a pre-made drink or getting food fed through your IV? There's no way to calculate that accurately. It's more of just an eyeball idea. Just sort of look at what you're eating and guesstimate that about 30% of the energy is coming from fat or less, and 10% or less from saturated fat, like animal fats or coconut oil, palm oil, and then focus more on olive oil. So pretty simple in that way, and that's the current recommendation. Now, I won't say that it will never change, because goodness knows nutrition has continued to change, certainly throughout my adult life, something new every year, but we're circling in on something that seems to be pretty stable, which is that we're learning much more about what causes heart disease, what causes insulin resistance, and it's not quite as simple as we wish that it was. But this whole argument about fat can be pretty confusing. So I hope that I did not make it more confusing for you. I hope I made it a little bit less confusing, so when you look on labels, you know what a monounsaturated fat is. Olive oil. You know what a polyunsaturated fat is. That would be other oils, omega-3, omega-6, other vegetable oils. You know what a saturated fat is, basically anything that's solid at room temperature, and you know that eating fat is not bad for you. In fact, not eating fat is bad for you. We learned that in the 80s. So I hope that helps. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe, and I can't wait to see you next week.